So we're back to Dogen. We're getting reasonably near the end here of the Genjo Koan. It's long, but I'm going to read you the text so far so that when we get to the lines for today, you can kind of put it in a context. There are various translations of this. You can find quite a few online if you want to see other ways of saying it. But this is what I'm using. When all dharmas are Buddha dharmas, there are delusion and realization, birth and death, Buddhas and living beings. And when the 10,000 dharmas are without self, there are no delusion, no realization, no Buddhas, no living beings, and no death. The Buddha way transcends being and non-being. Therefore, there are birth and death, delusion and enlightenment, living beings and Buddhas. Nevertheless, flowers fall though we love them, and weeds grow though we hate them. To carry the self forward and illuminate the 10,000 things is delusion. When the myriad things come forth and enlighten the self, this is awakening. Those who have great realization of delusion are Buddhas. Those who are greatly deluded about realization are sentient beings. Further, there are those who continue realizing beyond realization, and those who are deluded throughout delusion. When Buddhas are truly Buddhas, they do not necessarily notice that they are Buddhas. However, they are actualized Buddhas, and they go on realizing Buddha. When you see forms or hear sounds with the whole body in mind, even though we are experiencing them directly, it is not like a mirror's reflection, not like the water in the moon. While we are experiencing one side, we are blind to the other side. To study the Buddha way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be awakened by the 10,000 things. When actualized by the myriad things, your body and mind, as well as the body and minds of others, drop away. No trace of enlightenment remains, and this no trace continues endlessly. When you first seek Dharma, you imagine you are far away from its environs. At that moment when Dharma is authentically transmitted, you are immediately your original self. When you ride in a boat and watch the shore, you might assume that the shore is moving, but when you keep your eyes closely on the boat, you can see that it is the boat that moves. Similarly, if you examine the myriad things with a confused body and mind, you may suppose that you have a mind and an essence that are permanent. When you practice intimately and return to where you are, it will be clear that nothing has an unchanging self. Firewood becomes ash and does not become firewood again. Yet do not suppose that the ash is after and the firewood before. Understand that firewood abides in the condition of firewood, which fully includes before and after, while at the same time it is independent of before and after. Ash abides in the condition of ash, which fully includes before and after. Just as firewood does not become firewood again after it is ash, you do not return to birth after death. This being so, it is the established teaching in Buddha Dharma to deny that birth turns into death. Accordingly, birth is understood as beyond birth. It is an unshakable teaching that death does not turn into life. Accordingly, death is understood to be beyond death. Birth is a condition complete in this moment. Death is a condition complete in this moment. They are like winter and spring. You do not say that winter becomes spring or that spring becomes summer. Enlightenment is like the moon reflected on the water. The moon does not get wet, nor is the water broken. Although its light is wide and great, the moon is reflected even in a puddle an inch wide. The whole moon and the entire sky are reflected in a dewdrop on the grass, or even in one drop of water. Enlightenment does not divide you, just as the moon does not break the water. You cannot hinder enlightenment, just as a drop of water does not crush the moon in the sky. The depth of the drop is the height of the moon. Each reflection, however long or short its duration, manifests the vastness of the dewdrop and realizes the limitlessness of the moonlight in the sky. This is the passage that we did last time. When Dharma does not fill your whole body and mind, you may assume that it is already sufficient. When Dharma fills your body and mind, you will understand that something is missing. For example, when you sail out on a boat to the middle of the ocean where no land is in sight and view the four directions, the ocean looks circular and does not look any other way. But the ocean is neither round nor square. Its features are infinite in variety. It is like a palace. It is like a jewel. It only looks circular as far as you can see at that time. All things are like this. Although there are many features in the dusty world and the world beyond conditions, you see and understand only what your eye of practice can reach. In order to learn the nature of the myriad things, you must know that although they may look round or square, the other features of the oceans and mountains are infinite in variety. Whole worlds are there. It is not so only around you, but also directly beneath your feet or in a drop of water. So that brings us to today. So here's the passage for today, a short one, mercifully. A fish swims in the ocean, and no matter how far it swims, there is no end to the water. A bird flies in the sky, and no matter how far it flies, there is no end to the air. However, the fish and the bird have never left their elements. When their activity is large, their field is large. When their need is small, their field is small. Thus, each of them totally covers its full range, and each of them totally experiences its realm. If the bird leaves the air, it will die at once. If the fish leaves the water, it will die at once. So that's what we're going to take a look at today. So these first three lines sort of go together. This is where Dogen sets out the rest of the paragraph. A fish swims in the ocean, and no matter how far it swims, there is no end to the water. A bird flies in the sky, and no matter how far it flies, there is no end to the air. However, the fish and the bird have never left their elements. So he's laying out his premise here for this section. In it, he gives two examples in the form of metaphors. Generally, Dogen's pattern is he says something very philosophical and abstract, and then he'll give some examples. So in this section of Genjo Koan, he extends these metaphors across the entire paragraph, actually, so it's an extended metaphor. In the first line, the paragraph is of a fish swimming in the ocean, and in the second line, it's of a bird flying in the sky. So the key to understanding these lines is seeing what Dogen uses the fish and the bird to represent, and what the ocean and the sky represent for him. Remember, this is a metaphor, so it stands for something else. Dogen is pointing out here that the fish and the birds live immersed in a particular element, i.e. water or sky, and that they can never leave that element. They exist in it, and they can never exhaust it or find the end of it. So, you know, from our point of view, we know that if you're looking at them from the outside, that water does have an end to it. You know, a lake has a shore, and even an ocean ends at some point. And the air, at least the quality of air in which a bird can exist and maintain life, also has an end. If they go too high, they'll die, just as we will if we don't have oxygen. But because water and air are the context in which the fish and the bird exist, from their point of view, they can't leave this context. So for them, there's no end to the elements in which they exist. You know, even a goldfish in a tiny little bowl doesn't come to the end of the water, it just swims round and round. And should they leave the elements in which they are, then they will cease to exist, he says. So what Dogen is ultimately talking about here is not fish and birds so much, but about human beings. So we need to ask then, what is the ocean and the sky that Dogen sees us immersed in? And the answer is that he sees us immersed in Buddha nature. We might also say we're immersed in, quote, life as it is. It's a less lofty way of putting it. We might also say we're immersed in the net of Indra. So Dogen follows Buddha here in declaring that all sentient beings are inherently Buddha, or inherently Buddha nature. He's reminding us that Buddha nature is like the moon he spoke of in a former paragraph. The moon, he told us, is reflected in every single drop of water, however big or small. So here what he's saying is that Buddha nature also pervades everything, all beings, not only human beings, but particularly human beings. So this is the element in which Dogen sees us swimming. You know, we don't do it here, but in a formal Zen center or monastery, there are 3 different services each day. There's a morning service, a noon service, and an evening service. And each one of these services is dedicated to a particular thing, and they all have what they call a dedication. And one of the dedications says, Buddha nature pervades the whole universe, existing right here now. It's chanted in a song. So Buddha nature pervades the whole universe, existing right here now, blah, 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 and goes on. So this is what what Dogen is saying here. Buddha nature pervades everything, the whole universe. So that's what he's telling us by these metaphors. That's why he says that the fish finds no end of water. And the bird finds no end of the sky or the air, no matter how far he flies. Because Buddha nature pervades the whole universe. So he's making the same point about human beings. There is nowhere we can be, no circumstance in which we find ourselves, no condition in which we can exist outside Buddha nature, outside the net of Indra, outside life as it is, because if we're outside life as it is, we're dead. So Buddha nature is all inclusive. In that vast net of Indra, the whole universe is contained. Everything is in, nothing is outside. Now this sounds very wonderful until you get down to, practical everyday cases and start to live your life, because there are all sorts of things that we don't want to be in, right? Any aspect of ourselves that we're not happy with. Why am I so shy? Why am I so angry? Why do I always mess up? All those things about ourselves and our life that we don't like, then we actually want those to be out. I have students who come to interview, and what they want to do is use their Zen practice to become this sort of calm person that floats above everything. They no longer feel anger, they no longer feel inappropriate desire, they no longer, they are just, tranquil, non-attached. That is actually a word that's used in Buddhism, but that is not a word that applies to human beings. We're not non-attached. We're immersed and enmeshed in a net of life. And, this is what Barry is always talking about. Those of you who've heard Barry talk, when he says, your thoughts are you, your desires are you, your appetites are you, and he goes down this long list of everything that's included. And a lot of that stuff is stuff that we don't want to think is included, But what Dogen is saying here, it is included. Buddha nature pervades the whole universe. So if we define Buddha nature as we have in some of our past talks as, quote, the reality of life or things as they are, of course everything is included. If it's part of life, it's part of Buddha nature. How could anything be outside reality, outside life? This is why Dogen says the fish and the bird have never left their elements. How could they? There's nothing outside this element that we exist in, this Buddha nature, this life as it is. So when Dogen is talking about Buddha nature, he does not mean some mysterious ether out somewhere, some abstract kind of philosophical idea. He's not talking about that. To Dogen, Buddha nature is the very circumstances of our world, of our lives. It's how things are. So the point Dogen wants us to see is that we find our freedom right where we are, immersed in the ocean and the sky of our lives. No need to look for some other, different, better world. Each of us finds our life right here, right now. And there's no other place we can find it, because that's where we are. In the next lines, as he does throughout Genjo Koan, Dogen switches and he looks at things from a slightly different point of view from the first few lines. He says, when their activity is large, their field is large. When their need is small, their field is small. Thus, each of them totally covers the full range, and each of them totally experiences its realm. If the bird leaves the air, it will die at once. If the fish leaves the water, it will die at once. So, what does he mean by this? When their activity is large, their field is large. When their need is small, their field is small. Here he's looking from a more everyday ordinary point of view. He admits here that the limitless world of the fish and the birds and the sky, which he's been speaking about, does have limits from the point of view of everyday life. In a limitless world, there would be no large or small, right? You know, there's no way to compare in what we call the absolute. In emptiness, there's no large or small, because everything there is equal. There's no form anyway. So all would be one in this world, all would be equal. There could not be a way to compare the size of one thing to the size of another. So what he's nodding to here is the truth that though all of us are Buddhas, right? Some of us are Buddhas with larger insight than others. At least one of us is Dogen. So, you know, we're not all brilliant religious geniuses. Some of us are quite a bit smaller than Dogen. So what he's saying in terms of his metaphors here is that there are fish who swim in the ocean and fish who swim in a little fish tank. There are birds who fly thousands of miles across the world, you know, when they migrate. And then there are little sparrows who hop from branch to branch and look for crumbs to eat. So to extend this metaphor to human beings, what he's saying is there's a provisional everyday personality. All of us are just who we are. And then there's the Buddha, we all are. So there's big mind and there's small mind. There's emptiness and there's form. There are highly realized Buddhas and there are Buddhas without much insight whatsoever. There are Buddhas who have no idea they're even Buddhas. So remember that Dogen's major point in Genjo Koan is that true enlightenment must see both sides. Often he'll present one side, then he'll present the other side, and then he'll say, gotta have both. And not only do you have to have both, but both of them are the same. So you have to see both sides and you have to live according to the truths of both sides. You know, of course the tricky thing is to know at which point in your life it's relevant or skillful to use the relative, and which point it's skillful to use the absolute. It's not skillful to use the absolute to say that, you know, you shouldn't feel stressed when you're in a stressful situation. You know, when you're in a stressful situation, that's why it's called a stressful situation. You're stressed, and that's okay. You know, that it may be that your Buddha nature is unperturbed by all this, but you're stressed. So Dogen is saying that the scale of our Dharma insight is different. But that is all, it's just the scale. Regardless of our awareness or our delusion, all of us exist in Buddha nature. This is what Buddha said upon his enlightenment. I and all sentient beings are inherently enlightened. So having made the point that there are differences, Dogen is now discussing what that means in practical terms for our lives, and also pointing out that on one level there are no differences. He says in this next line, thus each of them totally covers the full range, its full range, and each of them totally experiences its realm. So what he's saying here is each fish and each bird are finite, particular beings. They're not just generic birds, they're a particular bird. We're not just generic humans, we're a particular human. And all beings are bound to particular localities and time frames. and humans are the same. Limitlessness, Buddha nature, i.e., can only be embodied in particular specific beings. You know, there's a saying, Buddha, the only hands that Buddha has are our hands. It has to be a specific person with a form and a body and hands and a brain. You know, Buddha nature cannot float about all by itself and transform the world. It has to transform the world in each of us. You know, it's like emptiness. Emptiness doesn't float around out. This is what Zen students think. You know, they're going to fall into a big, scary place of emptiness. But emptiness is not out there floating around. You can't fall into it. Emptiness only exists in form. It has to be the emptiness of something. This is why, you know, the sutra says form and emptiness work together as a box and its lid. They go together, like two arrows meeting in midair. So Dogen tells us that the fish and the birds totally cover their full range and totally experience their realm. So this phrase that's translated here as totally cover their full range, it's become a kind of famous Zen saying, and it's usually translated differently. It says, no one fails to cover the ground on which they stand. No one fails to cover the ground on which they stand. Each of you is totally you in the moment in which you stand. So each of you knows how to be you better than anyone else. Each of you can live your particular life better than anyone else. Whatever we encounter in this world, that's our life. Whoever we are, whatever circumstances we find ourselves in, all of it is the result of our karma. It's the result of specific causes and effects in our lives. Dogen goes on in the next line and says, if the bird leaves the air, it will die at once. If the fish leaves the water, it will die at once. When I first read these lines, I was a little unsure exactly what they were talking about here. But after studying it a bit, I've come to feel that what Dogen is explaining here is that all beings are beings only in their incarnation as a particularity. To fish, life as a fish is in the ocean, and all that goes with fish existence is their life. For a bird, life as a bird is in the sky, and all that goes with the existence of a bird is the bird life. So life does not exist as an abstract, apart from particular forms and circumstances. So clearly, if you leave the particular forms and circumstances of your life, you are dead. So there is no life for the fish outside the parameters of water. No life for the bird outside the parameters of air. Likewise for humans. To be a human, life as a human, you are subject to the necessity and limits of human life. This is life. We don't want to be subject to the limits of human life sometimes, but that is the truth. So Dogen is saying whatever conditions we find ourselves in, this is our only possible life. And we must meet this unique life skillfully. It doesn't mean that our conditions of life can't change, but when they do, then they will be our only possible life for those moments. On the cusp of each moment, we have to accept the reality and conditions of that moment that we're in. But part of that moment might be that we make a decision to be different the next moment. So we can, it's not like we're fated and we have to be a certain way. That isn't what karma means. At each cusp of a moment, we have a choice about the next moment. We don't have any choice about this moment, but we have a choice about the next moment. We have to live where we are with what we know in the time that we live in. This is thoroughly being in our realm. We do not need to worry about having all the answers for everybody all the time. Each moment we just hoe our patch. In doing this, we know that in our specific realm, since each thing contains every other thing, that nothing is lacking. We affect the whole universe, however small our personal realm, and we are in turn affected by the whole universe. This is what the net of Indra tells us, right? Every diamond reflects every other diamond. Dogen does not mean to encourage ignorance, i.e. you just hoe your patch and you don't pay attention to anything else, He doesn't want us to ignore the world around us, because that's part of our patch too, isn't it? But he does put emphasis on our immediate circumstances. In the end, we have to do what we can do and affect what we can affect and practice what we know how to practice. For some parts of life, we simply have to say, only don't know. Can't do everything. We can say metaphorically that just as the bird or the fish who tries to escape his realm dies, we too die in a way when we yearn for a different world than the one we find ourselves in. When we refuse the gift of the life we're given, denying our circumstances, denying ourselves, we cannot be said to be fully alive. We're bound by what we're bound by. That's one side of the truth. Yet there is nothing lacking. Everything is perfect, just the way it is. That's the other side of the truth. One of the people I've been reading to comment on this Genjo Koan is Nishijara, and he says in his comments on this section of Genjo Koan, how to be a true Buddhist is to find the meaning of life in your limited activity. This is true self. This is being in accord with Dharma. The two paragraphs which follow the one we're looking at today continue to use the same metaphor of fish and birds, ocean and sky. And we'll look at those paragraphs next time. So for today, I just want you to notice how beautifully the points Dogen is making in this extended metaphor about fish and birds fit with the major points he wants to make in the whole of Genjo Koan. Remember that the title of Genjo Koan, which is often translated as actualizing the fundamental point, which is kind of abstract, is also often translated as the koan of everyday life. And remember that this part of his writings was written for a lay student, and he mailed it to the guy as a letter. So that fits in very beautifully with our own particular practice here as lay practice. Koan, the word koan, as in koan of everyday life, we know implies ambiguity, paradox. This is what koans are. So what is the paradox of everyday life? What is the fundamental point that Dogen is talking about here? It is that the world of the relative, a world we think of as permanent forms, as independent entities, is not really a satisfying human world. It's too static. It's too boring. It's too limited. And most important, it does not accord with our actual lived experience. If we're seeing the world deeply, we can't believe in a total world of form, of materialism. We know there's something else. We may not be able to say, give it a name or say what it is, but we know that's not all there is. You know, it's like Shakespeare said, there are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamed of in your philosophy. So we know that there's more to the world than materialism. So this is the paradox of everyday life. How do we reconcile materialism, which we can see and hear and taste and smell and quantify, with those aspects of our being that we can't quantify, and which don't make much sense from a strictly practical point of view? You know, things like love, compassion, art, music, oneness, these things do not explain themselves well in the world of form. So Dogen tells us over and over again that we need both sides of this paradox. We need them both at the same time. That one cannot exist without the other because they're one. They're not separate. He also tells us that the only place to find both at the same time is in the very limited lives in which we all find ourselves. His view of time comes into play here too. He tells us over and over again, the only part of our lives that we can actually experience and verify is this very moment. This very moment is where we reconcile the two parts, the 2 points of view. Meet one moment, practice one moment. Take one breath, practice one breath. Suzuki Roshi, in his comments on this section of Genjo Koan, says this: it is enough if you do one thing sincerely. If you pick up even a small stone, you have the whole universe. So let these words be your guiding principle. What Dogen is ultimately saying here about this fish in the ocean is exactly what your old grandma probably told you. You're not the only fish in the sea. Think about other people sometimes. It's all connected. We're all in it together. So be kind and swim together. Don't be a shark.